It's been hosted by myself, Jennifer Stirrup, and our presenter today is Bill Anton, who is a business intelligence consultant who designs and develops data warehouses and business intelligence solutions using mainly the Microsoft stack. He can normally be found answering questions on MSDN forums and holds an active blog over at BYOBI, which is Brew Your Own Business Intelligence. So I recommend you head over and have a look after this session. And what we will talk about today is the tabular model. It's the new kid in the block in Analysis Services 2012. So we will have an introductory session. We will quickly cover and identify the differences between tabular and multidimensional models. We will also explore one in Visual Studio and look at creating a basic tabular model. For me personally, these sessions are really important because I still get a lot of customers asking me the difference between the different types of sessions, different types of models that are in play. So I'm sure everyone will get a lot out of the session. So we have a number of virtual chapters for PASS, so I'm a member of a few of these. This is a business intelligence one, but we also have big data, we have business analytics, and if you're interested in any of the other sessions, I would head over to the SQLpass.org website and you can have a look there. And I should say that this session is we're grateful to our sponsors, Pragmatic Works, who help us look after the business intelligence, and without the support, it's difficult to host these sessions as frequently as we do. So a big thank you to the team over there. Now, it's not just about us giving you information, it's the PASS community is a global community, so I'm from Scotland in case people are wondering where my accent is from. Usually we get a few questions just about that. But we have a very active volunteer program, and we do, I'm a volunteer, obviously based in the UK. And we have a whole SQL family who try to help us do various things for the SQL Server community. So what we do is you nominate your favourite volunteer for Outstanding Volunteer of the Month. And that's a lovely surprise if you win it. So if you can think of anybody, then I recommend you do that. We had the 24 Hours of PASS Summit preview. The recordings for this will be going up on the PASS site shortly. So if you are interested, I'd head over again to the SQLpass.org website and take a look there. I would also use the code BIVC if you are interested in registering for the PASS Summit, which will be held in October in Charlotte this year. So because you're members of the Business Intelligence Virtual Chapter, you will get a small discount to $150. So I really recommend, if you can go, that you should. I travel 5,000 miles to attend every year and I love it. So with that, our next session is on August the 21st, but what I will do is I'm going to hand over to Bill. And he's going to share some of his knowledge and expertise around the tabular model. So with that, I will hand over to Bill. And thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jen. I appreciate the intro. So yeah, today we're going to be talking about the tabular model, and I say the 20-minute tabular model because we'll spend the first half of the session kind of discussing, tabular as it relates to multidimensional, comparing and contrasting the two, so that we know when to use which. So for that, just a little bit about me. Jen covered most of it. I love data, and I am a dedicated fan of the Microsoft DWBI stack. I'm an independent consultant, and I'm a regular attendee of the Atlanta BI SQL Server Users Group. So if you're ever in town, we meet the last Monday of the month. You can reach out to me on Twitter or my blog or my email address. All right, so what we're going to learn today. We're going to learn when to use the tabular model, when not to use it, and how to build a basic one. So let's just go ahead and dive right in. This is basically my compare and contrast table that I use to kind of break it down to clients. Along the left-hand side, you have basically your criteria, requirements, the different dimensions that you're going to be evaluating these two models against. And then the last two columns are multidimensional and tabular. So we'll start from the top, and data size. This is a pretty easy one. Tabular is mostly an in-memory model, so you're going to be very limited on your data size. They do have large servers. Memory is very cheap, but you're pretty much not going to get a server with over 2 terabytes of RAM. So I say less than 1 terabyte for your model size with Tabular, and that's being pretty generous. You could probably squeeze a little more on a 2 terabyte server, but chances are that's a really expensive server, and 90% of the time you're not going to have it. Multidimensional, on the other hand, can scale all the way up to 24 terabytes, and that's actually a really interesting case study. I picked that one out specifically because it was there's a case study by Denny Lee and I think a few other members of the SQL Cat team where they built an analysis services cube on top of some Yahoo advertisement data for analytics. So I believe it's still the largest cube to date. So yeah, as you can see, that gets really large. So data size. The next one, hardware resources. And for both models, memory and CPU is fairly important. Obviously, with Tabular, you want to have more memory. But with multidimensional, that's where kind of your disk I/O comes into play. And it's been a big deal as far as eking out performance. So being able to pull the data off of disk and process it, these large fact tables doing aggregation type queries, disk I/O has predominantly been the bottleneck. You have random I/O patterns, and so now with solid state, you're starting to see more of that in play. It's been able to kind of close the gap with some of those with the disk I/O bottleneck, but still with Tabular, you don't even have to worry about disk because it's all going to be in memory. Query language is one that I used to kind of bring up, and that gap was closed back with, I believe it was Service Pack 1, Cumulative Update 4, and now there is DAXMD, and I believe that might have just been a code name, but basically what that means is that now multidimensional models can service the DAX query language. So DAX was that new language that was introduced back with Power Pivot when that was first released back in, I believe, 2010 with Excel. It is the query language that's predominantly used with Tabular, and it's supposed to be very easy to learn. It has a, I guess you'd say, a much shallower learning curve than MDX. Lots of people struggle with MDX, and so DAX is kind of a welcome relief. But that's no longer a differentiator because now you can run DAX queries against a multidimensional model. Now, where this really came into play was with PowerView. So PowerView is that really awesome reporting, I call it ad hoc reporting or self-service reporting tool that was kind of driving sales for SharePoint and SQL Server 2012. But kind of the downer when you speak to a lot of clients, they see PowerView, they want it, and then you tell them that they have to run it against a tabular model or against Power Pivot workbooks, and that large multidimensional cube that they spent thousands and thousands of dollars developing and putting together can't be used. You can't run PowerView reports off of it. But now that's no longer the case. So big line through that one. That's no longer a differentiator. Query performance. So this is kind of this is an interesting one because I have both of them listed as fast, and I'm differentiating with hard versus easy. So with Tabular, since everything is in memory, the majority of your queries are going to be fast no matter what. And by easy, I mean you don't have to do any complicated development. You don't have to be a very skilled developer to make queries run fast in Tabular. Whereas in multidimensional, you have to understand things like attribute relationships and designing aggregations and making sure your disk subsystem is configured optimally. There are lots of levers to pull there, but it can go fast. It's just really difficult to make it go fast. So that's kind of a really big one there. And it kind of ties into this next one, model complexity. So the reason I say that ties in there is because if you have a complicated tabular model, or if you have a complicated model and you try to fit it into tabular, you can run into some performance problems. You know, there are certain things that tabular doesn't do well. One of those being many-to-many relationships. So I consider that, you know, a complex modeling scenario. Multidimensional being, you know, a very mature product at this point. I believe it's best in class for OLAP servers. It can handle lots of these things. So, you know, you're talking parent-child hierarchies, custom roll-ups, many-to-many. All that stuff is handled natively. Whereas tabular, you're usually having to come up with some sort of hack or workaround, I should say, using the DAX query language to achieve the same effect. So model complexity, multidimensional natively handles a more complex model than tabular. The next item is security. So both of these models handle row-level security, and that is going to be the majority of the cases out there. Whenever security is involved, you know, you have certain sales managers who you only want them to be able to see sales for their regions kind of thing. That's row-level security. And cell-level security usually doesn't come in play unless it's, you know, some sort of, you know, financial kind of data behind the data model. And it performs poorly, and there's all sorts of caveats, and it's very complicated to put into place. So you don't really see it that often in the field. So I don't really consider that one too much of a deal breaker. Typical development effort: medium-high for multidimensional and low to medium for tabular. And this is really just kind of playing into the whole well, it's model complexity, really, which can take tabular to a medium. You know, if you have kind of many-to-many scenarios, or if you're trying to achieve some complex effect with the DAX query language, your development could be more at the medium level. Whereas multidimensional, usually the development effort is medium to high, as the developers need to understand things like attribute relationships, and they need to have a good grasp on MDX as the language, because you spend lots of time creating calculated measures and all sorts of good stuff. Tabular definitely goes down to the low side too, because you can actually import a power pivot model directly into a tabular project. And I've kind of blew my mind. I knew both of them were the same technology behind the scenes, but when I actually saw it for myself, I was amazed, because you're talking about taking, you know, you can do basically a little development session in Power Pivot, you know, with your business analyst or whoever, you know, go back and forth very quickly. So you're talking about rapid prototyping, and then when you're ready and you're at a good stopping point, you can just import that into an analysis services tabular model, and to begin, you know, developing on an enterprise server. So that really speeds up the time to solution. Licensing is also kind of an interesting one. Multidimensional, I put it down for all versions. There's a, you know, standard SQL Server license will support multidimensional, and there are some limitations there, but it does support it. Whereas tabular is only offered in the BI license and the enterprise license, of course. So those are definitely ones to keep in mind. And to be honest, I haven't actually seen anybody using the BI license. Usually the larger shops who are flirting with this technology already have, you know, some sort of enterprise license or licensing agreement that gets them whatever. So that's pretty much all I have for our tables and differences. So let's go on. So tabular limitations. Now this is just kind of, I mentioned a few of these things, but these are basically things that tabular cannot do natively. Many-to-many actions, translations, write-back data mining, and aggregations aren't necessary. So, and I have an asterisk by actions, and that's because it's actually possible to do actions. It's just not available yet in the GUI. there is a nice tool, and in fact, if you do any type of integration services or analysis services development in Visual Studio, you probably already have it installed, or if you don't, you should definitely go install it. It's called Bits Helper, and it has a lot of really cool functionality that helps out developers. So it'll allow you to create actions. But if you need any of these other things like translations, write back, data mining, for sure, you're going to have to go with analysis services, multidimensional. So what's the takeaway? One size doesn't fit all, right? So you really need to think about what your requirements are and what you're trying to achieve when you're evaluating these two models, because you could go down one road and you hit a wall, and whoops, you just wasted 2 months of development, and you need to circle back and convert over to multidimensional, or the other way around. So think long and hard about it, but know that there's definitely some middle ground between these two. You could probably, in a lot of cases, you could choose either and be fine. So, and as is going to be the majority of the session, a demo. So now we're going to switch over to Visual Studio, and we're going to develop a basic tabular model. So wait for this to load. All right, so let's start with a new project. So here's kind of the, you're creating a new project. You have your old multidimensional project types. Here's the analysis services tabular. Here's the typical import from an existing tabular database. And here's that import from PowerPivot that I was talking about. It's really cool. Definitely play around with this if you have some time. It might change the way you think about doing some prototyping work for your next project. But we're going to start from scratch, so I'm going to go with Analysis Services Tabular Project. Let me give it a good name, actually. Oop. All right. So first things to note is over here, we have a very clean solution explorer, whereas in multidimensional you'd have lots of things. You'd have data sources, data source views, dimensions, cubes, a lot of clutter in the screen. And that's not the case anymore. You just have one thing. You have your model. So another thing to mention is the workspace server. I just switched over to properties, but over here, workspace server. This is basically, you have to have a tabular instance that you develop against, and this can be on your local system. This can be a development server that is used by the entire development team, but you just have to have somewhere to develop against, and you'll see why once we get started. But right now I'm just pointed to my local instance. So my model is open, and the first thing we do is we go ahead and we import data. So I'm going to import data from a data source. And we can see that there are actually quite a few sources to choose from. You have a lot of relational sources, Oracle, Teradata, Sybase. You have some multidimensional sources. You can go from data feeds or even text files. But the majority of the time, you'll probably be developing tabular models against a data warehouse. So we're going to pick SQL Server, and I'm just going to go to my local host, and actually, yep, grab the AdventureWorks, make sure my connection's good. And here, you can specify a domain account. This is basically the account that will have access to your data source. So when you go to actually process your model down the road when we're done, it will use these credentials to go out there and query the data. So whatever credentials you use need to have access to the data. So I'm going to use a service account just because that's what I do in all my lab environments. And here we can actually write a query, or we can just select from a list of tables. So the majority of the time you'll be selecting from a list of tables, tables and views. It's actually kind of an important differentiator. So I have created views as I recommend everybody do, because it adds that layer of abstraction that kind of makes down-the-road adjustments much easier. I'm selected a couple tables. These are just straight up based off of the AdventureWorks Data Warehouse sample data set. And I'm going to give them friendly names because these are the kind of grouping names that we're going to see or that the end users will see in their reporting tools. So we want them to have something nice that makes sense. And you can also take a moment here to filter the data. You can preview it and filter it. I'm not going to filter it because it's a small data set, but if you're working against a production data set, or I should say you should never be working against a production data set, but if you're fortunate enough to have a production data set in your development environment to work against, you probably still don't want to develop against the entire data set. So you might want to filter your fact tables so that you're only bringing in a small amount of data. It just kind of makes the process go faster. You're not waiting as long in between the creation of different objects. You'll see what I mean once we get there. So now I'm going to hit finish, and this basically imports all the data into that workspace server. So I'm going to close this, and we can see right now that we kind of have like an Excel-looking environment. I have basically just a spreadsheet as it looks, and tabs at the bottom for the different tables. There's one for each. I like the diagram view the most, though, because, well, first of all, because I need to create my relationships, but also it helps you kind of visualize your model. So let me get my fact table over here. Spread this out a little bit. All right, and this is actually one of the downsides of developing against views, whereas if I had developed against the tables directly, it would have read in the referential integrity defined in the data source and created all these relationships for me. But since it didn't do that, I'm going to have to do it myself. So I'm just going to drag these down real quick and connect them to each other. It's also probably important to note that your data model can only have a single column-to-column relationship defined. It can't be a composite relationship. Like I can't have, customer key 1, customer key 2, and then customer key 1, customer key 2, and that defines the unique relationship between these two tables. It has to be a single. So this is definitely another reason to use surrogate keys in your data model. Also, quick note here about the date dimension. You'll see that I have, let me see if I can zoom in for you a little bit. I have these 3 relationships here, and we have one that's solid and 2 that are dotted. So it's a little bit different than in multidimensional world. In tabular mode, you have a single active relationship between 2 tables. You could define multiple relationships between them, but only one can be active at a time. And the only real implications are in the way you write your DAX measures, which we'll do later on. If you want to write them, for example, my active relationship is between order date and the date table. So any DAX measure that I write dealing in order dates, I don't really have to do anything special. But if I want to do something like due date or ship date, I need to use a different kind of approach to it. So with that said, let's continue going. I'm going to basically start kind of the same way I would do a multidimensional model. I would start with my dimensions, get those in good order, and then go on to create my measures. So I'm going to start and just show you a couple things we can do. So I have a customer dimension, and I'm going to go to that, and I'll tend to work in this area anytime I'm doing any type of column manipulation. So in this case, I'm just going to show you some basic DAX. So I'll create a column here. I just right-clicked and chose to insert a new column. And I'm just going to create a calculated column, just the last and first name. And this is, it's pretty common. to only slice your customers by their entire name versus their first and last name. Like you would never have their first name on rows and last name on columns type of thing. So now we'll have a last and first name. And all that processing that was going on right there, that's basically the model calculating this column and putting it into memory. So yeah, even though this is calculated on two existing columns in the model, it still takes up space in memory. So I have first name, last name, and even if I hide these guys, because I don't want the clients to see them through their tools, which I'll show you in a minute, I've got this guy in here, but I'm using all the space of these three columns in memory. So probably a better approach would to be going back to the view and removing these two columns from that view and just having this column come in. Probably save me a little space. But this is a dimension, so it's probably not taking up that much space anyway. So now that we have customer, we can see that I have that new customer name in there, and I hid those two columns from client tools, so that means they won't show up in the Field Explorer. So I'm actually going to go ahead at this point and hide a few other columns that I don't want our clients to see. Basically, all the key columns. I'll do these later, so we're going to do something with those. All right, now let's go on, and before we actually take a peek, and see what things are looking like, let's take a minute and go in and do some work on our date dimension. So I'm going to come in here, and first things first, I'm going to change the name of this column, and I'll just rename that to date. And I also want to change kind of the display here because, as you can see, all of these are in it's basically just a whole date, and they have a time portion in here, but it's not used for anything. So I can change that. Remove this guy. There we go. I can change that just a short date, and that's just kind of cleaner. One important step that you can never forget to do, and I say that because I have forgotten to do it before, is mark one of your tables as the date table. What this does is, and here it's just asking me to select the column that has the actual date data type. So the importance of doing this is that it now gives you access to a whole bunch of special date-related DAX functions. So essentially it's making it easier to write calculated measures using dates, date is a very common dimension to have in most analytical solutions anyway. So at this point, let's take a look and see how things are shaping up. So you'll notice up here at the top, I'm getting ready to click on it. It has this nice little Analyze in Excel, and I got to tell you, I'm a huge fan of this because this is how I like to work with the business users, going back and forth when prototyping. I like to show them the cube or the tabular model in Excel and let them kind of get a feel for slicing and dicing. So we can see that we have our customer name, so that'll show up. I notice that was really fast, right? Small data set, but that still has about, I want to say 60,000 rows in it? I'm not sure. Dates, we've got all these dates up. Oh, let's create a hierarchy. So I'm going to come back out here to the model view, and I'm going to grab a couple of these. I really am not a huge fan of calendar semester, so I'm going to pretend like I don't see it. And all I did was held down Control, and I selected the columns I wanted in the hierarchy, and I hit Create Hierarchy. And what this does is it creates a hierarchy down here at the bottom, and I'm going to give it a good name. So calendar year, quarter, month, date. I'm a big fan of this naming convention. I can't remember where I got it from. I saw it on somebody's blog post. It's a shame I can't remember who. But this is helpful, right? Because if you just see like calendar hierarchy, and I can't tell you how many analysis services databases I've seen that have multiple date hierarchies. And if you have a good naming convention, like now I can see this and I say it's year, quarter, month, date. Really, really helpful. So created this. Let's go back out and let's refresh our model. And here we can see that we have our date hierarchy. And we can see that everything is drilling down nicely except for these are out of order, right? So The problem here is that this is a text column and it is sorting in alphabetical order. So I can switch back over and I need to go into this table. Let me shrink them down. I'm going to go to the table and this month name right here, as you see, alphabetical order, I'm going to sort it by another column. So there's this icon right here, sort by column. I can click that. And the column I want to sort it by is month, number of year, because that's an integer, and it's going to roll in order 1 through 12, which is how I want my months to show up. So I make that change, and then I switch back over here and refresh my pivot table. So are you starting to get an idea of the, how nice it is to have, an Excel connected file during development? So this file right here, and this pivot table basically, is connected to my workspace database. So every time I make a change, I can flip back over here, refresh my pivot table, and notice that we now have our months in order. So this is really helpful, and it makes development just real nice, especially when you get to the calculated measures part, because that's really where you'd spend the majority of your time anyway. So going to, let me show you the workspace database while I'm at it. So here is my tabular instance. Let me refresh this. So here we have a couple databases. So ignore this one. This is just the AdventureWorks database. But this is my workspace database, 20-minute tabular model, or 20-minute tabular. I have my username and a unique GUID, or a GUID. But basically, this is just what I develop against. So technically, I could have multiple developers, and actually that's kind of an interesting point, especially if you're using source control. But if you have a shared development environment, maybe a shared workspace server, multiple users developing against the same, the same version. I don't really want to get into that because it's a single file. Well, not really a single file, but anyway, just to say, in a team development scenario, you have your username and unique GUID to keep everything separate. All right, so let's go back over here and let's see where we're at. We have date. Okay, so now we're going to come over here in product, and we want to do a product hierarchy, right? The problem here is that we have our product name, we have our subcategory, and we have our category, and they're all in different tables. And the problem here is that I can't create a hierarchy across these tables, so I have to pull all of them into a single table. So let me go into product, and this is where I'm going to pull in subcategory and category. So if you've ever used Excel, and I mean really used Excel, not like, kind of, and I don't want to get in trouble for saying this, but like a business user uses Excel. Some business users say they use Excel, but they don't really understand how to use Excel because they're not using any of the functions. But a VLOOKUP is one handy function if you're developing in Excel. So they have a similar function here, lookup value. And it's the same kind of deal, right? So let me just show you. So you basically have your, let me zoom in on this. So basically, I'm saying what I want to pull in, and here's the search criteria, to go figure out which value to pull in here. It's really not doing it justice, but because I have these relationships already defined, I don't even have to worry about that. I can just reference these straight up. So I can go into product category, if I can type. I'll do subcategory first. I can just reference it. So what I've done here is, let me go back in. I just use the related function, and I pointed to the table, and then in brackets I reference the column, and I can just pull that in, and it knows what I want, and it knows the relationship. So I'll just hit enter, and this is going to pull this in. Yeah. And so, as you see, as we wait for that delay, that's the kind of the thing I'm talking about when I said that it's a good idea to filter your data set during development. If you're working with a massive amount of data, that could take much longer. So this is a sample data set, and it still took an annoyingly long time. So I'm going to do the same thing I did with subcategory, except I'm going to do it with category. I'm going to rename these two columns, give them good names so that the users can understand them. Subcategory and category. Okay. So now that these columns are in this one table, I have category, subcategory, product name, I can select all of them and actually create my hierarchy. And notice this time I got everything in the right order. That's nice. Sometimes it doesn't get things in the right order. I don't know if you saw this in the date hierarchy, but the year was below the quarter and I had to drag it back up there. I'm not sure why that does that. Okay, so at this point I have everything I need out of these two tables in this table. So I really don't even need to display these tables to my users, so I'm going to hide them. I basically just selected the tables and then right-clicked and chose to hide them from Client Tools. So at this point I have a pretty decent looking model in terms of my dimensions. So let me just refresh everything and see what we have. So we have our little measures category here, and right now we don't have any defined measures, but I have, well, I have my 3 dimensions, and then this is the fact table. And this is kind of the interesting part about Tabular is that you can put measures, you can put calculated measures in any table. You don't have to simply specify, this fact table, this is a measure group, and these are the measures, and they're going to be completely separate from, attributes that I may want to slice and dice against. So kind of an interesting idea, but it should probably be used judiciously. So let's create some measures. I'm still kind of old school, so I'm going to stick with putting my measures in my fact table. And right off the bat, I know I'm going to want to have a sales amount measure. The cool thing here is that when you're doing your base measures, and I call these base measures because they're based on the base data. That's a lot of base. These base measures are based on column data. So I already have these in the column, and I just want to aggregate them. So I can select that column, and then I can come over here and select this. These are the standard kind of basic aggregation functions, if you will, and I can just select sum. And what this does is it goes ahead and it creates a calculated measure for me. So I'm going to give it a better name, but let's call this Internet Sales Amount. So that makes that easy. Notice the colon equal sign and then just my sum function. I also have, let's do, I'll just show you, distinct count is another one we can do here. So select a column, do distinct count. And that's kind of a cool one because, back in the days of, well, I say back in the days, multidimensionals didn't go away, but in multidimensional development, distinct counts is something that, you use a little bit of caution when adding to your multidimensional model just because you had to do certain things correctly, otherwise you get very terrible performance. So number of orders. So let's see what we have. Let's go back out and see what that looks like. So I've got my number of orders and I have my sales amount. And notice I got a good formatting on my sales amount, but I didn't get a good one on my number or on my distinct count. And the reason that is because the column that I did the distinct count on is actually a text column. So I need to change the format of this. And when I'm doing formats, it's something to pay attention to in calculated measure. I come over here into the properties column, and you have a nice format thing, and you notice that it's text. So I'm going to change that to, in this case, whole number, and I'm going to add in the comma, or I should call it the thousand separator because it's a comma or a period based on your locale. All right, let's refresh that. Yep, and it looks better. All right, so now let's create a couple more calculated measures. I'm not going to create as many as you normally would have in a full-blown model, just because this is the 20-minute model, and calculated measures is where you really spend most of your time. But one kind of important takeaway, that we're going to see here is that the process of building calculated measures is usually just kind of, like bricks, or you're, bricking up a wall. You just start building on top of your existing calculated measures and just keep doing it. So, for example, let's create an internet sales amount, for the year to date. So I just select any column down here in this, they call it the calculation area, and I just start typing, and notice it comes up here. So it's just like in Excel. So internet sales amount year to date. Do my colon equal sign, and then I'm going to start filling in my total year to date, and I have access right to this total year to date function specifically because I created my I declared my date table. So again, that's why this is important. If I hadn't done that, then I could still use this function and create this calculated measure, but it would not work correctly. So let me do my internet sales amount, and I gotta do my date table. And I'll explain what I'm doing here in a sec. Let's zoom in. So we have internet sales amount year to date, the name of my measure, colon equal sign, total year to date. So what this is saying is give me the total internet sales amount year to date based on the date table, and kind of remove the context filters in place. That's something that I'm definitely not going to get into. That's definitely worthy of a few presentations. DAX. I have a references page for this presentation on my blog that I'll put up the link before we end this out. But I have lots of resources. People who know this material, much better than I do. These are the people that I read and I follow. So I highly suggest you do the same if you're interested in this. So anyway, we have our internet sales amount year to date, and let's go ahead and change the format string. I want to make this a currency. And at this point, I'll switch back out to the model, give it a refresh so we see our new calculated measure pop up. Let me get rid of internet or number of orders, and we'll put this year to date out here. So we have our, our January, February, March, and you notice that the year to date is actually the running sum of these values. So you'll notice that the year to date for March is also the same amount as just the total amount for that whole quarter. So that's how we know it works. And that's kind of what I really like, again, about having this Excel connected worksheet, just popping back and forth, and testing out your calculated measures to make sure that you didn't make a mistake. So let's go ahead and let's build off this one, and I'm going to make this a little bit wider so we can see here. Let's do a prior year. So let's do an internet sales amount prior year. And for this one, I can just use a calculate, and I want to calculate the internet sales amount for the same period last year. And that's it. So as you can see, if you look closely at this function, it's really intuitive. I'm just saying calculate the internet sales amount for the same period last year of what my date is. So I can switch back over. Oh, don't ever forget to change your format. I always forget. All right, so we refresh, and we'll pop this guy out here. And now we have our prior year. So what I have down here is January of 2007, and in the prior year field I should have the January of 2006, which I do. And we can see that it follows along perfectly. So we know that's correct. All right, and like I said, it's just an iterative process. You keep building and building. So now we can do an internet sales amount prior year to date. And this time I am just going to do the prior year. Oop. Yes, I'm going to do the prior year. Same periods last year. What am I doing? Prior year to date. Oh, my year to date. No. You remember which measure you're working with. There we go. Oh, I got an error here. So the IntelliSense is nice, but notice that sometimes it's too nice, like it adds in that double bracket. Oh, I did it again. Come on, stop doing that. There we go. Okay. And we'll switch back over. So, prior year date. And as you can see, I forgot to format. But we have our prior year right here. And we can see that this is just basically doing the year-to-date amount on them. So if you wanted to do something like comparing the year-to-date versus the prior year-to-date kind of thing, if you're rolling it up that way. Yeah, sky's the limit really when it comes to developing your calculated measures. I'll go ahead and change the format of that to currency, just because I'm OCD like that. And we have our model, right? So in a real scenario, I would continue developing. I'd add in, whatever I thought the user would need, whatever I need to create, downstream tasks and user stories, such as reports or dashboards, and really anything the user tells me they need. And really, the name of the game here is simply creating the best user experience possible. So making sure you're paying attention to your naming conventions and your measure formats, stuff like that. It's really no different than any other type of development, at that semantic layer for multidimensional. You're playing the same game, right? You're trying to satisfy the user and give them a nice data model to slice and dice against. So a couple of finishing touches here. We would probably want to create some roles. So here there's just a drop down in the menu from the model. I can come into the role manager and I can create a role to give users access to my data model. And this is really the part where you would implement any type of row level security. So these are your row filters. You can actually access a DAX function called username and do some dynamic security. In fact, the design pattern for dynamic row level security is the exact same as it is for multidimensional. So you can basically just look that up. I believe I have a reference on my blog that I'll bring up in a sec. But essentially, I haven't added any members. This is my lab machine. I have admin rights to it, so I can access everything. But we'll just create a role just for the sake of creating a role. And now we're ready to deploy it to the server. And again, I'm just going to deploy this to my local instance. But here I'm over in Solution Explorer. I'll go to the properties of my solution. And here's where I'll point it. Let me just zoom in. I'll point it to my server I want to deploy to, the edition, give it a good name. Cube name, not really a big deal. You can name it whatever you want. Model's the default. Query mode, and I didn't touch on this in the kind of in the breakdown tables, but both multidimensional and tabular support a real-time. Well, I guess it's best to describe it as pass-through. So in multidimensional, it's called ROLAP or real-time OLAP. Well, in tabular, it's going to be called direct query. And it's essentially just, you're putting out a semantic model that users can query against, and all the queries pass through onto your relational source. So anyway, it's all set up, and I can just right-click on this and hit deploy. So basically, this is sticking it out there and processing it on my server. And we'll go over there, and we'll check it out. And I should have... There we go. And so that's the one I just deployed. Notice it drops the username and GUID. So everything's in here. Got my tables, connections, and roles. So essentially that's it. So at this point it looks like we may have. Nope, no questions. All right, cool. I'm going to bring up my slides again. I've got one more on just a touch on DAX, because this is an interesting one for me, because I remember when this was coming out, well, early in 2012, and then went released to production in April of 2012. But this was one of the biggest selling points that I kept hearing over and over, and it almost felt like it was overdrawn. So this is my interpretation of the DAX versus MDX learning curve. So what this is basically it shows MDX here in red, and I say it has a steep learning curve because it's really difficult to wrap your head around it at first. But then you get to a certain point, and things just start to click, and you can start to do really complicated stuff with it. Whereas with DAX, everything's very easy at first. It's almost like Excel, and then you start to do more complicated stuff, and you just get wrapped up in different levels of filtering and all sorts of well, complex scenarios, and DAX becomes really difficult. So in the end, they still kind of meet. So like I said, it's what you want. Once you click with MDX, or maybe if you don't have to do very advanced stuff, you can stick with DAX. It's up to you. But now that both models support both languages, that's going to kind of fizzle out. So at this point, I'm going to open it up to questions, and I'm going to drop it over here. This is the reference page on my blog where I have all of the references that I use, I have resources, books, stuff like that I've read up on, basically for Tabular and DAX in general. So definitely go there. I'll post my slides here as well, and I think Jen's going to be posting this presentation to the past VI virtual chapter website. And again, here's that little discount code. So at this point, I'm going to see what we have here.
Hello there, Bill. Thank you very much for your session. It was really good. And we do have a few questions which I'll take you through. The first question is from Jamie. I think, sorry, the screen isn't very clear. And he wants to know what happens when the tabular model runs out of memory.
Oh, that's a good question. So there's really kind of two ways it can fail. So, well, I guess you say it comes down to a setting. There's a configuration at the server level where you can actually allow it to page to disk, kind of like virtual memory. So that would prevent you from straight up failing. But that's not exactly a common setting to use, because the whole point is to keep it in memory, to keep everything fast. And when you're paging to disk, you're not going to be fast. So the most common scenario when running out of memory is during processing. And what you'll see is you'll see a large model on a server that maybe has just a little bit more memory than the size of the model, and somebody will do a full process on it. So at that point, what Analysis Services Tabular tries to do is it tries to keep the current model in memory, and it tries to process the new version of the model side by side. So essentially, to do that, you would need just about double the memory. And that's where you run into your out-of-memory exception. So if you're processing and you run out of memory, processing will fail, and it'll keep the current cube in memory. Or another scenario is when, again, you're on an improperly sized server, speaking in terms of the hardware, the memory. So you have a server where you're almost maxed out on RAM, just having the model in memory, and users run maybe some expensive queries, expensive DAX queries against the model, and it pulls a lot of the data out of the model and expands it in memory, and then, oops, you ran out of memory. You push it to the limit. At that point, only thing that happens there is the user's query will fail. So you could see, failure in a number of ways. So whether you're processing and processing fails, or your users are running expensive reports or ad hoc queries, their queries or reports will fail. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you very much. And we have a few more questions. Lance has asked if direct query in Tabular means that you aren't limited by server memory. And the second part of the question, any thoughts on direct query going against relational with column store indexes for really large data sets? So the
Yeah,
first,
so that's, oh yeah. So I'll kind of knock both of those out, I guess. The first one is running out of memory with the, when using direct query, and I imagine it is, theoretically possible. It's just very unlikely. You would have to have such a small DAC server. I just imagine there's a little bit of overhead, and I'm talking minuscule. So I would basically just say no, it's not possible. But all of the memory at that point is simply going to be used on your backend server, your relational server, where you're executing your query. To the other point about running direct query against the relational source and the implications of having column store indexing on your relational source, that's extremely interesting. And I think I've seen a couple of presentations, especially at SQLBits, well, through their videos. I wish I could actually attend in person, but where you've seen people using both multidimensional and tabular in their real-time pass-through query modes, running against SQL Server 2012 as a backend data source, where they have been working with column store indexing to basically bring up the speed of the query response. Now, the only caveat there is that currently in SQL Server 2012, column store indexes aren't updatable, so it'll get you around the large data side or your memory limitations, but you kind of lose out on that real-time aspect, because you'd have to be doing your table partitioning to continue to swap new data in, and that's actually one of the major draws of having that real-time or the direct query. So hopefully I answered that. It's definitely possible. You'll see people doing it.
yes, that's fine. Thank you very much. A few more questions. Tabular, this is a question from Donald. Donald wants to know if Tabular can do incremental updates.
Yes, so you can do incremental processing in Tabular. I didn't touch on that at all. I kind of just disregard that as an advanced topic. In fact, there was another gentleman, Chris Schmidt, who presented a few weeks ago for this same past BI virtual chapter, who handled advanced tabular model scenarios, and that was one of them. The incremental processing is a really interesting way to process your model, just because it reduces the amount of memory you have. So earlier when I was talking about running out of memory, when you're processing, you're doing a full process on the entire tabular model that actually requires 2x the amount of memory. Well, that's kind of that's big overhead to have just another whole chunk, 100% of memory just sitting there ready to be processed. So if you process incrementally, you can actually reduce the amount of RAM you need to have on the server. So you don't need 2x the amount of memory as the size of your model. You could probably get by with 1.5 or less, just depending on how large your biggest fact table and partitions are in it. So that's a very good question.
All right, that's great. Thank you very much. We have some more questions. Steve Albrecht has asked if you can demo how you can point this model in Excel as an end user. So if you were an end user and you were using Excel, how could you point Excel at the tabular model?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just pull up Excel and close this book. Let's see here. Okay, blank workbook. So I've got Excel 2013. Love it. Everybody should get it. And I just go to my data tab, and I want to grab data from other sources. And in this case, I'm going to go against analysis services. And so I have this window here, and I just basically go out to my server name, and it's a local named instance, so the /. And if I can remember what I called it, that's the name of my instance. Yeah, so this is actually, so you can see my workspace database is still out there. This is the one we deployed, and I can connect to it just like that. And it'll bring it in. I can bring it in as a pivot table. I can actually go Power View against it. So hopefully this doesn't crash my video sharing. I know I had some issues with GeoFlow. Yeah, so let me hide this window. There we go. We see my field list over here. Product, internet sales. Yeah, so a little bit slow, but again, this is just my old laptop. But yeah, so that's basically just connecting to it. I could have chosen, just a pivot table over here. I chose Power View. It's going to be your more common bet, especially with users with 2013 hitting a tabular model.
Yep, that's good. Thank you very much. The next question is, how can you work with user-supplied inputs and calculated measures? So this is just an example of a scenario. So the question is, can you work with user-supplied inputs and calculated measures?
That's an interesting question. So if you want the user to be able to, it almost sounds like you're asking if there's write back in there. And in that case, unfortunately, there's not. You could, however, have maybe like an Excel workbook as one of the sources of data for your tabular model. So like when we pulled in data from the AdventureWorks data warehouse. We could have added another table as just like an Excel workbook out on a network share or something. And that way we could have users go out there and change data in the Excel file. And so each night or whenever we go to reprocess the model, whenever we process that table, it would pull in the updated values. So that's one way. It's almost like write back, but it's not quite the same. Hopefully that answered your question. If not, you can reach out to me.
Thank you. Two more questions. One is from David. Why not create the model in Power Pivot as opposed to Visual Studio? I think the thinking there is that obviously with Power Pivot you use Excel to do that, but here we've used Visual Studio.
Right, yeah. So actually normally when I'm starting from scratch, I would probably prototype in Excel and Power Pivot until I got pretty far along just working with the business user. And at that point, once we have a pretty stable model, then I would import it into Visual Studio. But one of the main reasons for working out of Visual Studio is source control. Being able to tie into TFS is really nice to make sure you don't lose anything, and also for team development scenarios. So you're right. Working in Power Pivot is really nice, especially for that initial prototyping. But anytime you want to get it into source control, you want to stick it in Visual Studio, and especially if you're doing work on an existing tabular model, it's usually going to be in Visual Studio. So.
Yep, that's good. Thank you. And then the final question is from Sardis, who asks, what can Tabular do? What Tabular can't do that I can do in the cube? I think probably the answer to that is one of your earlier slides. So maybe if you want to play that one up again, just as a summary.
Back over there.
Yeah.
I believe this is it. So this is one of them here. I got my GoToMeeting in the way. There we go. So as far as what it can't do, translations, write back, there's a bit of a workaround for that. Data mining, definitely not. Most of the other things, like parent-child hierarchies that I mentioned, many-to-many, custom roll-ups, stuff like that, there's ways to get around it, getting creative with DAX. But usually the cost is flexibility. For example, parent-child hierarchies aren't natively supported, but there are DAX functions you can use to flatten the hierarchy. And it's all in memory, so it's really quick. The problem is when you flatten a hierarchy, and this applies to any time you're flattening the hierarchy, you have to know how many levels deep it is. And if the data ever increases in levels past what you've defined, your model will either blow up or you'll get incorrect results. So there are usually caveats to the workarounds.
That's great, thank you very much. What we will do is I will make myself the presenter.
Okay.
And just to go through a few things, let me see, sorry. I will close the screen and you should be able to see my slide deck now. So what we have here is our next session is Wednesday, August the 21st, which is 4 p.m. GMT, noon Eastern Standard Time, and also 9 o'clock PDT. And that will be held, presented by Mike Berger, and the subject will be Master Data Services. So we'll look forward to that one. And here we have to stay involved, so sign up at sequelpass.org, and our contact details are below. And last but not least, I'd like to say a big thank you to Bill for his excellent presentation and also his time in answering all the questions at the end. I'm sure you find that useful. What I will do is I will pick some random names from the list of attendees, and you will receive a book voucher from our sponsors, Pragmatic Works. So I will release the news about that. Will be tomorrow. Alright, so just to say thank you very much to Bill. We will post the recordings for this as soon as we can up on the website. So watch our website for that happening, and also the Twitter stream as well. And with that, I'd like to wish you all good morning, good afternoon and good evening wherever you happen to be in the world. Thank you all for your time, and we'll see you again for the next one.
Thanks a lot, Jen.
Thank you.